actually stemmed from my own experience teaching one of these courses, but really noticing a shift in teaching courses such as Indigenous literatures, or courses where I teach Indigenous maternal pedagogies, to suddenly being in a mainstream teacher ed program and teaching required courses that were in spaces that could be described as predominantly Eurocentric. So there was one or two, if any, Indigenous students in an environment that was largely comprised of non-Indigenous students. And so as an Indigenous instructor of these courses, I started to feel the anti-Indigenous racism, and it was quite unsettling, and I thought, if I'm feeling this as the instructor, what is my Indigenous student over there feeling, right? How is that feeling for them? But also being really curious about the shift from being in a space that can be described, as we heard from one of the earlier presenters, as like empowering or transforming, to suddenly being in a space that was really unsettling. And so I was curious about that, and that's sort of like what started the inspiration for this study. But it's also grounded in the background, it's also sort of like stems from the TRC's calls to action for reconciliation education. So in terms of an overview of the study and an emphasis on cultural safety and ethical space, the purpose was to explore the experiences of Indigenous instructors who teach and Indigenous students enrolled in these courses throughout, in teacher education programs throughout Canada. So we specifically focused on the University of Manitoba, the University of Winnipeg, and Lakehead University, to examine the experiences of Indigenous instructors of these courses with this emphasis on Indigenous cultural safety, examine the experiences of Indigenous students in the course with an emphasis on Indigenous cultural safety, and then to investigate the pedagogical implications and possibilities of these courses. So our study considers how immediate responses to the TRC's calls to action shape the learning experience for Indigenous students within Eurocentric spaces. And so it's really important, as I noted earlier, to understand that within these courses, Indigenous students who are highly underrepresented in teacher education programs suddenly move from being largely invisible to highly visible, right? And so topics such as residential schools, the 60s scoop, racialized, sexualized, and gender-based violences are being unpacked in these courses, and students come in with varying levels of experience. So as Adam Gaudry stated, it's really important that the experiences of Indigenous students are centered in these courses versus sort of trying to package a course for non-Indigenous students. And so some of the findings were that, I'll talk about the findings in a minute, but just to give some context, that students, non-Indigenous students, might come into these courses with varying understandings of residential schools, some of them learning about it for the first time, etc. Where this may be most likely familiar to Indigenous students in the classroom, right? So again, they're sitting in this classroom where they're kind of being forced to learn about these things in a space where they're faced with residential school denialism, as an example. I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Deer to talk a little bit about the study site and the context.
So the notion that a faculty of education would make courses that are nominally Indigenous with content pedagogy appropriate to those courses is still being negotiated in a lot of places across the territories, I would say. What made this study interesting is it took advantage of a number of faculties that had a legacy, let's say, of having such required courses. Manitoba is interesting because it didn't come from the university necessarily, although there were discussions at the time about having a required course, but it was difficult to have those conversations in predominantly non-Indigenous faculty. What occurred was really quite interesting. There was some politicking with government to ensure that this was a developing important area in a region for which First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples, that demographic was growing. So the mandate came from the provincial government in the case of Manitoba in 2006, and a year later we had to have those courses running with the idea that anybody graduating from an initial teacher education program would have that course. That wasn't the case for Lakehead, but they did have a required course not too long after the 2006 government mandate in Manitoba, and they've had that running for quite a while. And in the case of Manitoba, the University of Manitoba, which was the first site I think for that we had data collection, there are options for which students might take up this requirement to Indigenous education courses. One which is more foundations in nature, the other being curriculum teaching and learning with focus on First Nations, Inuit, and Métis education. So, covering your notes. Sorry.
So I'll talk a little bit about the findings, but first I just wanted to comment on the methodologies. So as Dr. Deer mentioned, one of the first sharing circles we held was at the University of Manitoba in the space that you saw in the video. That wasn't the sharing circle, that was an experience that I had teaching Indigenous methodologies in the space, but it was in that space, which I think is really important to consider. So the data for this study was collected through sharing circle methodology. And so each sharing circle was guided by an elder from each territory where we had the circle. So we had sharing circles at the University of Manitoba, sharing circles at the University of Winnipeg, and then we had virtual sharing circles at Lakehead University. So this study actually started in 2019, and then we paused the study during the pandemic. There were other important considerations, and so we reflected on that, and it was really important to not continue with the study for a while. And then I think it was kind of towards maybe early 2021 when we picked things back up and had virtual sharing circles. And so some of the findings went from, topics related to Indigenous cultural safety and ethical space within face-to-face classes, but we also noticed a shift, particularly at the circles at Lakehead University, but even circles that we had later in Winnipeg, where students were talking about how it felt experiencing this course during a virtual classroom, right, which really shifted the pedagogy. It was also a time when teachers who didn't teach virtually before were also learning how to do that. So there were a lot of factors that came into play that we couldn't imagine before when we were planning this study. And so, can you go back first? So the study looked at a vision of Indigenous cultural safety and ethical space. And we asked questions about that in the sharing circles, and the findings really reaffirmed the experiences that I had that inspired the study. But one thing that came out that we weren't expecting was this idea about relational space. And so we kind of break together cultural safety, ethical space, and relational space. And I'm just going to read a few quotations from the participants just to kind of offer examples of that. And so one participant said, I think the cultural safety was one of the paramount things that our instructors focused on. Like that was one of the key components, everyone feeling comfortable. And again, these are Indigenous instructors teaching this course, which is important to remember as well. And another participant, I think our instructor did the best to make it a very ethical space, to create a safe space for people to talk about difficult things. And then the final participant, in terms of relationality, a big part of that is identity. And so one of the things that I intentionally do in my, sorry, this is from one of the instructors, in my Indigenous education course, is to invite people to think deliberately about who they are. This is sometimes absent in Western discourse. So asking questions such as, who am I? You know, am I friends? Who are my friends? And am I proud of who I am? And so that's a quotation from one of the instructors, and one of the things that students also commented on that was that the instructor brought humanity to the course, right? Like, we often don't talk about those kind of things, like, who am I? Who are my friends? In fact, when I started teaching this course in teacher ed, and I got my awful course evaluations, which racialized, particularly racialized women often get in course evaluations, I was critiqued for bringing that personal into the classroom. And those of you know my work, I'm an Indigenous maternal scholar, and so I often bring in the fact, my role as a mother into the courses. I'll talk about bringing my son to a hockey game or a lacrosse game the night before, right? And I do this as a way of relating with students. So that relational space is something that's really important in Indigenous courses. And I think I said this a little bit earlier, but some of the terms used to describe experiences in the Indigenous literatures courses that I teach that aren't mandated courses are that they're transformative, they're empowering, they're affirming. And yet the terms to describe this course that is a required course relate to a lot of anti-Indigenous racism. And I'll pass
we're going to start getting into recommendations or insights that sort of may lead to, for purposes of amendment on the part of faculties of education. But one of the things that seems clear to me, not just as a result of the study, but this was a big part of it, but through experience as being a faculty member in a place like the University of Manitoba, is that climate and culture matters. Which is why establishing those places that may foster those ethical spaces are really important. So the image that you have there is Kamahama is the name that was given by the pipe carriers for that space, and it means an Anishinaabe-Moan gathering place. It was a lovely experience to have that there. So the spaces matter, the faculty matter, and some of the things that we've heard over the years, certainly in the last little while since the reconciliatory impulses really gripped at least some of the faculty across Canada, has led us to come to consider what our commitments are to Indigenous ed. So one of the things that I find myself wondering more the older I get, because it sort of matters, is how we are accountable to ourselves as faculty members, as universities and such. So the reconciliatory action plan is something that we've taken up in our faculty as well as our university. There's not many faculties or academic units that I know of that have such action plans, but that number is growing. And within it, ours, for better or for worse, does map onto the university strategic plan. At the time, the kind of idea there was mapping onto the responsibilities of teaching, research, and service and other important matters for our university. What we do there is to try our level best to make our faculty, our programs very, very welcoming and have some utility, which I'll talk about in a minute, to the professional and personal journeys of our students. I really appreciated Jan's comment about the teacher shortage issue, something that as a university administrator I face with a lot. The Indigenous teacher shortage is something that we hear about a lot from our community partners, and hoping that we will somehow magically churn out more teachers is something that we're looking at. And it puts me in mind of the well-known piece by Verna Kirkness and Ray Barnhart of all those years ago, 1991, First Nations and higher education, the 4 Rs. And it served as a sort of framework for coming to design the study, as well as to come to understand what the data represented at that time. So how many minutes do I have there? 5 minutes. Okay, now go. You'll recall that frame that Kirkinson and Barnhart put, and they situated it within a First Nations frame. I think it works for the purposes of what we try to do in the study. The first of those being respect for First Nations cultural integrity. In trying to capture some of the stories that we heard from students, there were many positive observations about the First Nations and the instructors in these courses, not all of them. And there were some that I frankly didn't expect, right? And we heard stories like this, that you need a referent, whether it's historical or something that's drawn from the current news to interface with when you're doing the foundations course, for instance, for Indigenous education. In order to do that, you have to grapple with some pretty tough situations, but because they're not always terribly historical, things that are happening right now and are also being discussed in a class for which some of the students have to live that thing, whatever that thing might be that you're discussing. That's tough for some students to be effective learners in, as we heard from those. So what does that point to? Well, it points to a responsibility on the part of faculty members to, one, be mindful of the sort of content they're using to cause learning, or to help to cause learning within their classes, but also to be mindful of relationship building, which is difficult in a 9-week or 13-week course. With the Inuit, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit students that are in your class, because you're not talking about something that's happened decades or centuries ago. You're talking about something that's important right now. The manner through which we, if I may say, we have been treating women and girls. But that's one example. There are others. Is something that's affecting our students right now anyway. So it's something to be mindful of. The second, our relevance to First Nations perspectives and experience, the trivialization of Indigenous experiences is something that's not lost on many First Nations Métis students. So one of the things that we have found is the importance of ensuring that our programming is certainly relevant to the professional and personal journeys of our students. Really quite important. Reciprocal relationships was it yielded an interesting sort of observation in some sort of students, because whether a tough story or topic to explore something really positive, you do have frequently some number of, for instance, in the case of Manitoba, Anishinaabe or Cree students who are a part of the community for which whatever that story or that knowledge piece is being explored are there. And we did hear some interest on the part of some of the participants to have those students engage in the sharing of those stories, in the exploration of those topics, because they're talking about their community. It's no longer an abstraction in the textbook, it's something that's relevant, and the value that may be added to that experience, because you have people who have the experiential views on whatever's being discussed, whether it has to do with ceremony, whether it has to do with traditional ecological knowledge, as it's sometimes called, is really quite important. And finally, responsibility through participation, because many, well, all frankly, of the participants were part of classes that were diverse in nature. You don't have these teacher education classes or programs that were specific to Indigenous students. There was a mix of backgrounds there, and if you take on board the reconciliatory impulse, what did Senator Sinclair say of reconciliation? The journey towards a new relationship with amongst Indigenous and non-Indigenous students, whilst maintaining that sense of that shared and sometimes really tough history. And the responsibility to that process is really quite important. And yes, First Nations, Inuit, Métis students and communities have a responsibility to that, but so does everybody else. And it's something that ought to be reflected in the approaches and the programming. So,
we saw the way that really came about in the sharing circles. So I just want to share a definition of what this fifth R is, that we intended to reverence by honoring Pigeon's work, and it reminds us of the place of sacred knowledge. And so this integral part of doing research through sharing circle methodologies means that we acknowledge the spiritual elements that might come through in the Indigenous research engagement as elders and traditional knowledge keepers guide research circles, but also as Indigenous students are able to have their experience affirmed in circle by hearing from other Indigenous students that have similar experiences. And so there are things that, thinking about the question earlier about extraction, there are things that took place in those circles that aren't meant for academic consumption, right? They stay in the circles. And so that's where reverence comes in. There were also a lot of participants that said this opening teaching that opened the circle, so each elder offered a traditional teaching, said that's what they yearned for in the classes. They yearned for going beyond surface level Indigenous content to having some of these teachings come through in the courses. I know we're running out of time, but I also wanted to say reverence is also about really honoring and recognizing the gift of the data or the story that emerges from the research and knowing what belongs in knowledge mobilization and what needs to stay in the circle. And so really being aware of that. And, again, there's an image of Gamamo where we had our first sharing circle, and it's just a wonderful space, and so being able to teach in that space also, the environment, the location is also really important. So now I go on